Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be tackling how Indigenous rights in the U.S. and Canada were impacted during the Cold War. It's a really complex topic and potentially a little difficult in parts. We'll be using excerpts from a history podcast episode to guide our conversation today.
Okay.
And by the end, you'll understand not just what happened, but why these events still matter today. So, ready to jump in?
Absolutely. It's like we're looking beneath the surface of Cold War history, uncovering these hidden impacts on Indigenous communities, but within these very nations.
Exactly. Okay, so let's start with the Termination Era in the U.S. during the 1950s. Can you give us a quick rundown of what was happening?
Okay, so in the 1950s, the U.S. government, they pursued this policy of termination, and the goal was to assimilate Native Americans into mainstream society.
Okay.
It involved ending federal recognition of many tribes,
Wow.
effectively dismantling reservations and tribal governments.
That sounds pretty radical. What was the reasoning behind such a drastic policy?
Well, the Cold War created immense pressure for, national unity and conformity and cultural and racial differences.
Yeah.
Like, those on reservations were viewed with suspicion. Policymakers believed that assimilating Native Americans would somehow strengthen the nation.
Right.
It was seen as eliminating this potential divisiveness
Yeah.
during a time of, global ideological conflict.
So they were basically bringing the Cold War fight home, applying it to their own citizens.
Yes. And the person they appointed to oversee this policy
Oh,
was Meyer.
okay.
The same person who ran the Japanese-American internment camps during World War II.
Hold on a second.
Yeah.
That's the same guy.
Yes.
It's like they're using the same playbook, just targeting a different group this time. This doesn't sound good.
No. His appointment immediately raised concerns among Indigenous communities, and understandably so.
I can imagine.
So Meyer introduced this relocation program designed to encourage Native Americans to leave reservations and move to urban areas with promises of jobs and better living conditions.
Right.
But the reality was very different.
Oh, I was going to say, it sounds like they were setting them up to fail.
Many faced significant economic hardship,
Yeah.
discrimination, and isolation in these new environments, and many ultimately returned to their reservations, often worse off than before.
That's heartbreaking. It's hard to imagine the upheaval and the disappointment these families must have experienced.
Yeah.
But the government didn't stop there, right? They actually went further to sever ties with tribal nations.
Yes. So in 1953, the U.S. Congress passed House Concurrent Resolution 108,
Okay.
which officially ended the U.S. government's relationship with numerous tribes,
Oh, wow.
particularly those with valuable resources or land.
It figures.
And this had a devastating impact.
Can you give us some specific examples? I know the podcast mentions the Menominee and Klamath tribes. What happened to them?
Well, these tribes were hit particularly hard.
Okay.
Termination meant losing their land, which for generations had been held communally.
Right.
They also lost access to health care,
Wow.
education, and essential government services.
Jeez.
Much of their land was sold off to non-native individuals and corporations,
It's unimaginable.
essentially stripping these communities of their economic foundation and their cultural heritage.
Having your ancestral homelands,
Yeah.
the very foundation of your identity,
Right.
suddenly stripped away. This is the reality that the Menominee and Klamath faced.
Right.
And it raises the question, how could this happen? Historians have very different views on how to interpret this era, right?
Yeah.
What does the revisionist school say about all of this?
So revisionist historians see this as a blatant power grab,
Right.
fueled by economic interests who wanted to exploit native resources.
Oh, okay.
They argue that the government used the Cold War as a convenient excuse
Right.
to take control of valuable land and resources.
So in their view, it wasn't really about national unity, but about profit and exploitation.
Exactly. And then there's the consensus school,
Okay.
who view these policies as well-intentioned, but ultimately disastrous attempts at integration.
So good intentions with awful outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
But how could anyone believe that forcing people to abandon their culture and way of life would somehow lead to a better future?
You have to remember the Cold War context.
Yeah.
Conformity was prized above all else.
Right.
Any difference could be seen as a threat.
Yeah.
And sadly, Native American communities, often geographically isolated,
Right.
lacked the national platform and resources
Well,
to effectively fight back.
And during the same time that the civil rights movement was gaining traction.
Exactly.
So while African Americans were fighting for equality on a national stage, Native Americans were facing a different kind of battle, often in isolation.
That's right. It was a very different fight.
Yeah.
And the challenges they faced were unique.
So this paints a very grim picture.
Yeah.
But I understand that despite these overwhelming challenges, there was resistance to these policies.
Absolutely.
What form did that take?
Well, many Native leaders and organizations actively spoke out against termination and relocation.
Okay.
They emphasized the fundamental connection between land, culture, and identity,
Right.
arguing that assimilation was not the answer.
It makes sense.
Tribes like the Menominee and Klamath, they launched legal challenges
Okay.
and organized grassroots campaigns to protect their rights and their land. They weren't going down without a fight.
These were acts of incredible courage and resilience in the face of such adversity.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the National Congress of American Indians, or NCAI,
Okay.
became a vital platform for advocacy.
Okay.
They worked tirelessly to bring national attention to the issue,
Right.
halt the termination process, and protect native lands.
So it sounds like these efforts helped lay the groundwork for the Red Power movement that would emerge later on. This push for assimilation really backfired, didn't it?
It certainly had the opposite effect of what was intended.
Right.
Instead of disappearing, these communities rallied together to protect their heritage and fight for self-determination.
Now, while this was happening in the U.S., Canada was taking a different but still complicated approach.
Right.
Okay, let's explore what was happening north of the border. In Canada, they actually took steps to lift bans on certain cultural practices, right?
They did. In 1951, Canada amended the Indian Act.
Okay.
And this lifted bans on cultural practices that had been outlawed for decades.
Wow.
Things like the potlatch ceremony and the sun dance were once again permitted.
That sounds like a positive step. What was the motivation behind this?
Well, on the surface, it appeared progressive.
Right.
But it's important to understand that the government still maintained significant control over Indigenous communities.
Okay, so it was a bit of a give-and-take situation.
Exactly.
So they were allowed to practice their traditions, but still under the watchful eye of the government. It wasn't true freedom.
Exactly. And then in 1956, Canada granted formal citizenship to Inuit and what they called status Indians.
Okay.
Individuals registered under the Indian Act.
That was a huge step, wasn't it?
It was.
Being recognized as full citizens with voting rights must have been a significant victory for Indigenous communities.
It was a landmark moment, but it's important to note that this didn't erase the deeply ingrained paternalistic systems.
Oh, okay.
Band councils. The governing bodies on reserves were given more decision-making power, but they could still be overruled by the Department of Indian Affairs.
So even with citizenship, true self-governance remained elusive.
Exactly.
What about the living conditions on reserves? Did anything change there?
Unfortunately, not much.
Okay.
Poverty, discrimination, and poor living conditions remain widespread.
It seems like a classic example of granting rights on paper without addressing the underlying systemic issues that perpetuate inequality. What do historians have to say about this approach?
Well, the progressive school of historians really focuses on this point.
Okay.
They argue that Canada's approach during this era, while appearing more benevolent than the U.S., failed to deliver meaningful change in terms of economic and social equality.
It's a reminder that reforms, even when well-intentioned, can fall short if they don't tackle the root causes of injustice. What about the Indigenous school of history?
That's where we'll pick things up after a short break.
All right. Sounds good.
Don't go anywhere.
So before the break, we were talking about how differently the U.S. and Canada approached Indigenous policy during the Cold War.
Right.
I'm curious to hear how the Indigenous school of history interprets these events.
Yeah, so for the Indigenous school, it's about centering the experiences and perspectives of Native American and First Nations people.
Okay.
They emphasize the resilience and the resistance demonstrated in the face of these assimilationist policies.
So rather than focusing on the actions of the government,
Yeah.
they highlight the agency and strength of Indigenous communities.
Exactly. They see this period as a catalyst for the Indigenous rights movements that gain momentum in the following decades. You know, the very policies that were designed to erase Indigenous cultures often had the opposite effect, fueling this renewed determination to protect and reclaim their heritage.
It's like that saying, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Exactly.
This attempt to erase their cultures ultimately resulted in the opposite, a stronger sense of identity.
It's a testament to the enduring spirit of these communities.
Yeah.
They refused to be silenced or assimilated.
Now let's talk about the long-term impacts of these policies. In the U.S., it seems like the termination policy was ultimately deemed a failure.
Yes. By the 1960s, it became clear that termination had caused immense harm.
Okay.
And many tribes fought tirelessly to restore their federal recognition and reclaim their lost lands.
And were those efforts successful?
Absolutely. The Menominee tribe, for instance,
Okay.
successfully regained federal recognition in 1973.
Wow.
After years of legal battles and grassroots organizing.
Good for them.
These victories were hard-won.
Yeah.
And they paved the way for the Red Power movement, which demanded self-determination and a return to traditional values and practices.
So, in a way, the government's actions backfired.
Right.
They unintentionally helped spark this powerful movement for Indigenous rights.
That's a key takeaway here.
Yeah.
Attempts to erase Native American cultures and dismantle their communities actually led to a resurgence of activism and a renewed focus on tribal sovereignty.
That's pretty amazing when you think about it.
It is.
What about in Canada? What happened there following the granting of citizenship and the easing of restrictions on cultural practices?
Well, while those reforms were significant steps,
Yeah.
they didn't address the deeply rooted problems of poverty, lack of access to resources, and the ongoing lack of true self-determination.
Right.
Life on many reserves remained incredibly challenging.
So even with formal recognition as citizens, Indigenous communities were still facing an uphill battle.
That's right. The legacy of colonialism and government control continued to hinder progress. First Nations leaders continued to advocate for greater autonomy, control over their own affairs, and access to resources and opportunities.
Right.
It was clear that simply granting rights on paper wasn't enough to achieve true equality.
It seems like a recurring theme in history.
Yeah.
Creating laws or policies that sound good on the surface,
Right.
but failing to address those underlying systemic issues.
It highlights the importance of understanding the complexities of these historical periods.
Yeah.
And recognizing that positive change requires more than just symbolic gestures.
Right.
It demands systemic change and a genuine commitment to addressing the root causes of inequality.
Absolutely.
And that's something that Indigenous communities in both the U.S. and Canada are still fighting for today.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
And it's clear that the Cold War wasn't just an international conflict.
Right.
It also deeply impacted Indigenous communities within these very nations.
If we connect all of this back to the bigger picture, what we see is that the anxieties of the Cold War, the fears about communism, and this emphasis on conformity had a ripple effect that reached all the way to reservations and Indigenous communities.
It's fascinating how seemingly unrelated events can be interconnected in such profound ways.
History is full of these unexpected connections.
Yeah.
And by delving deeper, by peeling back the layers, we gain this richer understanding of the past and how it continues to shape our present.
This deep dive has certainly been eye-opening for me. I feel like I've gained a much better understanding of how the Cold War, often viewed as a global struggle, played out in the lives of Indigenous communities right here in North America.
It's a part of history that's often overlooked or glossed over.
Yeah.
But it's crucial to understanding the challenges Indigenous communities face today.
Right.
These weren't just abstract policies.
Yeah.
They were real-life events that had a profound impact on individuals, families, and entire communities.
And it's a reminder that the fight for justice and equality is an ongoing process.
Absolutely. The struggle for Indigenous rights and self-determination didn't end with the Cold War.
Right.
It continues to this day. And it's up to all of us to educate ourselves about these issues, amplify Indigenous voices, and work towards a future where their rights and sovereignty are fully respected.
I think one of the most important takeaways from our deep dive today is the recognition that history isn't just a collection of facts and dates, but a tapestry of interconnected stories and experiences. And by exploring those stories, we gain a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
Well said.
Yeah.
By understanding the past, we equip ourselves to create a more just and equitable future for all.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left with a sense of both sadness and hope. Sadness for the injustices that were inflicted, but hope for a future where those wrongs can be addressed and true reconciliation can begin.
I show that sentiment. By confronting the difficult truths of the past, we create a path towards a more just and equitable future for all.
Thanks for joining us on this journey.
Of course.
It's been a challenging but incredibly important conversation.
And remember, the deep dive doesn't end here.
Right.
Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.
Thanks for listening, everybody. We can't just brush aside this period of history.
No, absolutely not.
The policies enacted during the Cold War are woven into the fabric of both the U.S. and Canada and their relationship with Indigenous communities.
Exactly. It's like we pulled on this loose thread and revealed all these complex connections between Cold War anxieties and the policies that impacted Indigenous people. And the consequences are still felt today.
It's fascinating how each historical lens that we've explored, the consensus, revisionist, progressive, and Indigenous, each one adds another layer of understanding to these events.
Yeah, the consensus view helps us understand the mindset at the time.
Right.
The revisionist perspective, well, it unveils potential ulterior motives. The progressive lens underscores the socioeconomic consequences. And the Indigenous school of history reminds us to center the voices and experiences of those most affected.
It's a powerful reminder that history is rarely straightforward.
Right.
There are always multiple perspectives to consider.
Yeah.
And as we move forward, we need to grapple with some challenging questions.
Absolutely.
What does true reconciliation look like? How can we ensure that the rights and self-determination of Indigenous communities are protected?
Those are questions we all need to think about. We can't ignore the past,
Right.
but we can learn from it and work to dismantle the systems that perpetuate injustice.
Absolutely.
We have to ask ourselves, how can we support economic development and cultural revitalization in Indigenous communities?
Yeah.
How can we be allies in their fight for equality and self-determination?
I think this deep dive has really highlighted the importance of awareness.
It has.
We can't solve problems we don't understand. And by understanding the historical context, we're better equipped to create a more just future for everyone.
It's not about placing blame
Right.
or dwelling on the past.
Yeah.
It's about acknowledging the truth, understanding the complexities, and using that knowledge to build a better future where the rights and cultures of all people are respected.
So as we conclude this deep dive,
Yeah.
I'm left with a sense of responsibility.
Okay.
It's up to each of us to continue learning, engaging, and working towards a future where Indigenous communities can thrive.
And remember, the learning doesn't end here.
No.
I encourage you to seek out Indigenous voices, explore resources, and challenge yourself to think critically about these issues. The journey towards reconciliation is a long one.
Yeah.
And it requires all of us to participate.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into a complex and crucial part of history.
It was my pleasure.
Let's continue these conversations, amplify Indigenous voices, and work together to create a more just and equitable future for all. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.